and your eyes before.
Good afternoon. We'll be calling the Ordinance Committee meeting to order. May we have a roll call vote?
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Here.
Councilmember Rouse. Here. Madam Chair Snedden.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will begin with public comment on our first item for consideration, mobile home park conversion regulations update. And our first speaker will be Chris Barros. Oh,
Madam Chair.
Forgive me. May I invite the presentation from staff? Thank you.
Thank you. And barring any public comment not on items on the agenda, I'd like to begin with the discussion of the mobile home park conversion regulations that have been in the works for a few years. So what we'll do is give an overview of what the 4 ordinance proposals in front of the committee today are. We'll talk about the background, how we got here, what the council directed us to try and achieve with this update, and then some of the major issues that still need to be resolved by the committee, Planning Commission, and council. So first, today's proposals. I mentioned 4 ordinances. 2 of them are far more substantive than the other 2. And those are the first one relating to relocation assistance for conversions. One of the first concerns that the council had was to update the city's existing relocation assistance for conversion ordinance to be at least as protective as the County of Santa Barbara's similar ordinance for mobile home park residents. Secondly, the other major ordinance is Chapter 2750, and that's a body of law that had to be updated to match changes in state law. The state law regulates the conversion of mobile home parks to resident ownership. That's where the coach owners buy the land from the park owner. That's regulated through a law called the Subdivision Map Act. So we had to touch that law to bring up to date the tenant protections that have been written into state law since the city's basic rules were written in the mid-'80s. The 2 less significant ordinances involve the process issues for how those conversion permits are handled. 2703010 changes the first decision maker from being a staff hearing officer or planning commission to being the chief of building and zoning. That's a position designated by the director. There would still be appeals to the Planning Commission and Council, but we're recommending starting with a technical staff official because the decisions that have to be made about compensation are very technical in nature and should be refined by a staffer before they get to an appointed or elected body. And likewise, 2707030 is a cleanup amendment to match the changes in the subdivision law that we have to follow. Okay, let's talk about the background. This is an old slide. I'm not positive how current it is. This is a listing of the parks that we were aware of a few years ago in Santa Barbara. So there are a significant number, not a massive number, but real people, and if my recollection serves me, at the time the housing element was done, the city was concerned about a loss in the number of spaces. So again, winter 2016, concerns about conversion. The specific issues that the council was concerned about was displacement of existing residents and loss of affordable housing. As you know, the mobile home parks provide a stable supply of relatively affordable housing in Santa Barbara, and disruption of that supply is particularly harmful to the longtime residents. So the council directed that we move forward and try and get to standards similar to those of the county. I mentioned this before, I'll say it again. This is a very complex area of the law. It involves regulating an economic marketplace. The city is inserting itself in the financial transaction between the park owners and the coach owners. It's very quantitative, a lot of math. So our recommendation that you have a staff officer do the analysis before it comes to you. There's a lot of state preemption, and there's a lot of litigation. So these are all markers of an area where we want to be pretty careful, and that's what we've done. We retained outside counsel to review our regulations and make sure that we were within the bounds as we prepared them. I also want to note that we're certainly going to have more civic engagement, definitely at the Planning Commission, and I've put out feelers. If any of the park folks would like additional meetings, I'm happy to make myself available to do that. So let's talk about the rationale for the update and the policy basis. So really, the city stance hasn't changed on this issue since 1984. And what that says to me is that in creating the laws or the amendments to the laws that are in front of you, we were not creating new council policy. We were simply taking existing policy and technically updating it to do what it was meant to do when it was originally enacted. So as you can see, since '84, we've had discretionary review of conversions, and we've had some degree of assistance benefits paid when parks are converted. Now, legal basis, I mentioned the housing element. I think a significant reduction in the number of mobile home park and permanent RV spaces between 2000 and 2015. I don't know whether that 390 number holds today. And again, the '84 ordinance was just outdated. Okay. So when you're working with a 30-plus-year-old ordinance, you check to make sure that the original concept is defensible, and I'm happy to say it is. The notion of providing protection in the mobile home park environment has been around a long time because of the unusual form of ownership. The park owner owns the land, and in most instances, the coach owner rents the land from the park owner. So there is an unavoidable economic relationship between how much the property is rented for to the coach owner and the value of the land. The lower the coach rents, the less value for the land, and vice versa. Major issues that we covered. You've seen these before, but they're worth reiterating. On the left column, you'll see the city's existing rules. On the right column, the county's existing rules. We were worried about being more specific in our ordinance because the current ordinance doesn't define how far away the comparable parks need to be for the computation of moving expenses or rental subsidies. The county uses 25 miles. In terms of consultation, the city's existing ordinance doesn't require informational meetings where the park owner is required to really take the time and spend the money to educate the residents what's happening with the conversion, what their rights are. And there's no requirement in our current ordinance that the park owner retain a relocation specialist who actually understands all of the intricate economics of mobile homes and moving mobile homes. The county has those features, so we wanted to copy those. The relocation duty is very similar, and that's because the language is general in nature. It really comes out of the constitutional limits on what the city can do. And here, both the city and county laws are trying to mitigate adverse impacts on the residents. So the laws presume there is a harm caused to the park residents by this imbalance of bargaining power, hence the government regulation to try and address that harm. It's important to keep in mind because the city is limited, that its regulations should address that harm rather than enrich coach owners at the expense of park owners. You're trying to find a happy medium, so to speak, between those two economic interests. Now, what we know a little more about today than we did last time has to do with the range of distances that might be used. And let's try and understand how distances are used in this ordinance. First of all, if the goal, as is stated up on this slide, is to mitigate the adverse impact of conversion or closure, one of the adverse impacts is the cost to physically move the coach to a new park. And so in these ordinances, you need to set a measuring stick, or it's advisable to set a measuring stick that says how far away do we use as a distance to measure the moving expenses for the coach and fixtures and related material that the coach owner has. For reasons we'll get to in a minute, we're recommending 35 miles. You have a fair range of discretion. You'll recall that the last time we came to you, we were talking about using split mileage differences where 50 miles might be the distance for the cost of moving the coach, whereas 25 miles might be the distance for measuring the other part of the assistance, which is a rental subsidy paid to the coach owner to make up the difference between higher rent, if it is higher, at the new location and the existing rent that they were paying at the park. Okay? So there are two forms of compensation that we're generally worrying about here. One is the cost of moving the coach. The other is the cost of higher rent at a new park. Okay, so we showed you this last time, and it's hard to see, so I'll talk you through it. These are concentric circles where the center is Santa Barbara, and the mileage is measuring how far out you would get at 25, 30, 40, and 50 miles. As you can see, in general, 50 miles, Santa Maria is just outside 50 miles. Buellton and Solvang are within 40. Ventura and Oxnard are within 40. So what we did with the proposed ordinance after your discussion last time was to take a look at more specific data about park distances from Santa Barbara and narrow the range. Instead of 25 to 50, it looks like 35 miles is a sweet spot. You have a lot of discretion to choose a different number, but 35 miles looks like a sweet spot. Let me show you why I'm saying that. I'm going to jump past this. We'll come back to the benefits. I have to refer you to the staff report. This version apparently did not include my tables. In the body of the staff report, at page 5, you see the beginnings of 3 charts. What these charts represent is the number of mobile home park spaces and their distance from Santa Barbara. So the first one is mobile home park space distance distribution within Santa Barbara County, including cities. And what you'll see is that when you weight the distances by the number of units, so if you look at that first chart, when you get out to, say, 52, 53 miles, there are 1,300 units up at the top there. That's Santa Maria, okay? When you weight the median distance from Santa Barbara in Santa Barbara County is 47 miles. So if you were just looking at Santa Barbara County and you wanted to find out what the median distance is for people to relocate their coach, you would use 47 miles as a median in Santa Barbara County. Now, the next chart does the same thing for the city of Ventura, and the median distance to Ventura Parks is only 28 miles. All right? And then the third chart is Oxnard. The median distance from Santa Barbara for parks in Oxnard is 35 miles. So looking at Santa Barbara County at 47, at the city of Ventura at 28, and Oxnard as 35, you get the range of distance numbers that you may use for the ordinance. Now, having explained that, let me back up to where those figures show up in the ordinance. Okay. Okay, this is excuse me. This slide shows the existing city rules for relocation. And as you can see from the left-hand column, the moving expenses are capped at only $2,000. That number was one of the main reasons that the council was concerned with the relocation expense. That's extremely low. The county, by way of contrast, uses a much higher multiple of monthly rents. Now, what we're proposing in this ordinance appears mainly in section N, which is on page Roman numeral 3, 228 of the ordinance that has the Garamond type. Okay? So this would be attachment 4, excuse me, make sure I get that right. This is, I'm reading from attachment A to attachment 5 of your packet. Attachment 5 is the ordinance amending section 3185-290 of the municipal code.
Mr. Kalan, may I
Yes.
pause to ask a question? Is that amount, if the radius is set at, say, 25, does the coach owner need to relocate within that 25, or is it that's the amount of money to be able to relocate and then they could choose to relocate farther away, or is it only an offering of that resettlement money if they stay within that radius that we define?
No, the coach owner has the choice once that payment's made.
Thank you.
So beginning again at page 229, 229, the section on relocation assistance begins, and it's broken up into three pieces. It's broken up into the section that okay. If a home can be relocated, the owner receives the 35-mile moving expense and 12 months of rent subsidy. That's the proposal. And in direct answer to your question, Councilmember Sneddon, the ordinance says that if no spaces within 35 miles are available, the mobile home may also be moved to a homeowner-approved site as requested by the homeowner at a cost to the applicant that doesn't exceed the 35-mile move. Okay.
To follow up on that, if there is a space available, but the coach owner chooses not to, they still receive the lump sum to be able to relocate at a place of their choice?
The ordinance doesn't address that, and I'm not sure. I think the answer should be yes, but I'll want to look at that. So let me make a note now so I can come back to you with a response on that.
Thank you.
Okay, back to the ordinance itself. 3-230, relocation assistance for homeowners whose homes cannot be moved. If it's not feasible to move within 35 miles, the applicant provides the following relocation assistance to each homeowner. The applicant's required to buy the mobile home and pay the in-place sale value. That was a concern raised by many of the park residents, that they get in-place value if the home can't be moved. That's number one. Number two, the applicant pays the cost of moving within 35 miles. That's, again, if there's an option to move it. And, again, there's the lump sum 12-month rent differential payment that's provided. Okay. The last category tries to take into account residences in parks that may not be mobile homes. And it provides the relocation assistance that's described up on the slide. Okay. The last category that the relocation benefit covers is permanent occupants who are renters rather than coach owners, and they get the moving costs for 35 miles, 30 days of household expenses, and a lump sum amounting to 4 times the rental rate within 35 miles or $9,000, whichever is greater. And disabled get $11,000. Okay. And lastly, Councilmember Sneddon, if my memory serves me, this slide is attempting to say that the applicant has to pay both of those benefits, not so that the moving would be paid even if there isn't a move. But again, I'll confirm that. Okay, that was a little rough, but I'm open to questions at this point. I really think there are just two policy groupings here. How far and how much?
Thank you. I have a question from Councilmember Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Colon, so how far and how much? So, are both of those unaddressed in state law? And since we are talking about moving probably within the city to within the county or maybe into another county, are those other agencies comparable in terms of what their standing policies are or ordinances?
I know that Ventura has mobile home rent control. I can't speak to Oxnard off the top of my head. So I think that the main characteristic is rent control parks or not. Now, I'm assuming they have vacancy decontrol, which is when a space is open, the rent rises to market. I don't know that for sure, but the legal constraint here is that the burden being placed on the park owner needs to be reasonably related to the impact they're causing on the coach owner, and the part that's governed by state law relates to how a conversion to resident ownership happens. There have been unfortunate incidents where park owners have tried to use what are known as sham conversions. Namely, on the face of it, it looks like an effort to convert the park to ownership by the coach owners. But in fact, at the end of the day, the coach owners are gone and the park is subdivided and something else happens. So the state law is concerned with, and our ordinance builds off the state law to make sure there is something called a bona fide resident survey. And that lets the city measure whether the residents of the park want it to convert to resident ownership. So that's the big part of this that's driven by state law. And it again arises under the Subdivision Map Act. Just so everyone is on the same page, the Subdivision Map Act is a law that says that you can't sell, lease, or finance property if you've divided it into more than 4 parcels without a subdivision map. So it's a way of regulating how land gets divided. It applies here because, like a condominium, a subdivision of the park would allow the coach owners or someone else to buy the individual spaces that are subdivided and are now otherwise commonly owned by the park owner. All right? So the state law part is the part relating to conversion to resident ownership. That's heavily preempted by state law. The part that isn't preempted and really is based on constitutional principles and case law is the miles and the money.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It says here that a disabled person will receive up to $11,000 for relocation. Mm-hmm. What's the definition of disabled? Is that just physically disabled, or is there a definition of?
There is a state law definition. I don't know that we referred to it specifically in the ordinance, but it includes physical and mental disabilities.
Okay.
The issue becomes, how does that get determined? And the park owner's generally not in a position to inquire, so it becomes a process of the disabled individual needing to advocate for their rights.
Thank you.
Do we have any further questions before we take public comment? Okay. So we have 3 speakers on this item. The first speaker at this time will be Chris Barros.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your work. I know it's been a real headache and intricate. We're thrilled with what we have seen so far. I personally feel like we asked for one thing and got more than we even asked for, so thrilled in that respect. I do have a question about attachment number 1 that was sent out recently. I don't know, but it was on the last page, on the last, second to the last Q&A. Am I entitled to relocation assistance if my home in my park does not meet the definition of a mobile home? Now, I have a place in my heart for the people at the mobile home park next to us that I'm not sure what category they fit into, but as you recall at a previous meeting, we had a big showing of people from there who were concerned about how things were going, and there was a big language barrier as well. So I'm very worried about those people over there, and I know that we have the same owners now that own us, own them. But it says relocation assistance. It says, yes, if you are a permanent park resident without a mobile home, which I think applies to the people at Tropicana or Tropical Gardens, whatever that is, it says you're entitled to the cost of moving your unit. Well, if they don't own a unit, how do they get entitled to the cost of moving the unit? I was confused by that statement. That's all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next public comment will be from Sharon Rose, followed by Jim Farned.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having this hearing, and I want to thank staff for all their hard work. My name is Sharon Rose. I'm Vice President of the South Coast Alliance of Mobile Home Park Residents. And as Mr. Colon mentioned, this is a very unique form of housing. It really has two owners, the park owner and the homeowner. We have mortgages. Many of the people in these communities have lived there 35 years, their families. These are stable communities, and if folks do have to relocate, we hope it will be close enough that their communities can stay intact. I feel happy about the marketplace value element that's in this ordinance and the relocation benefits, and I want to hear more from one of our leaders, Ann Anderson, who worked very heavily on the Santa Barbara County ordinance. I know that you're not dealing with this today, but we're really asking for you to move forward on the mobile home park zoning because we think that's going to ultimately give us housing security and more protection that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker on this item, Jim Farned. Do we have a slip in for? Yes, but bring Jim Farned up now, and we can have more speakers on this item.
Hi, I'm Jim Farned, and several things. First, we residents would like to commend the city attorney for his accessibility and attention to our concerns. Secondly, I'd like to mention that Flamingo Park was described as for sale. It's been sold. Richard Sanders is no longer the owner. Secondly, those two items for the first question. Secondly, median versus mean. I'm not sure whether it should be mean or median. here. That seems kind of dicey. I think I might even feel more comfortable with mean, but I just want to raise the question as to why median is. Thirdly, in-place value, the question of in-place value. This is a complex matter because we have rent decontrol. So when a coach owner dies or is whatever, often it's because of a death, the park owner, this was adjudicated back in '84 or something like that, the park owner can raise things to what would then be market value. So what happens is the coach is bought for, since the rent's gone up so high, it's bought at a premium and replaced with a manufactured home, and the whole situation is sold for $150,000. So they buy the coach for $10,000, destroy it, put a manufactured home there, and now sell the whole situation for $150,000, $180,000. That's happening in our park. That doesn't seem right for some reason to several of us, and I don't know. That may be just, a lucky draw for the park owner, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Mitigation here is balanced with cost of relocation, but the question is it the relocation of the coach, physical coach, or is it the relocation of the occupant? And it seems to me the question should be relocation of the occupant and the socioeconomic health consequences involved in that relocation. That's a different matter. And I think that's all I noticed, so thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker will be Ann Anderson.
Thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation for everyone that has been involved in this project. I started working with the folks in Flamingo a couple of years ago to try to get this ordinance through, and I'm really very happy to see how it has come out. I want to thank Mr. Kalan and everyone in the committee for their hard work. I just wanted to speak a little bit to the distance. I feel that it's very important for people, particularly elderly folks, senior folks, disabled folks, people who have formed a community within a city where they live. They need to be near places that they can still conveniently reach, such as medical, their doctors and their medical facilities and their community and their families and the people that live that they're used to having for neighbors. And the problem is that if these folks are going to wind up maybe having to go as far away as Santa Maria or Oxnard, it really takes them out of their community. And this is why I really appreciate the fact that we can provide people with the in-place market value of their homes so that what their real option is going to be is to purchase a mobile home in a park that is within the same range what they're used to living, that they would not have to relocate to a far distance. And this is why I think that the in-place market value option is very important, because when you really look at it, there's really nowhere to move a mobile home to. I mean, you can go out 100 miles and you won't find an empty space. So the bottom line is these people have to move out of their park, purchase a mobile home in another park, and there's plenty of homes for sale. That's not a problem. They could relocate maybe within the city of Santa Barbara, but certainly into the outskirts of the city. But they need to have that in-place market value so that they receive enough of the money, the equity that they've put into their homes, which they're going to have to walk away from. Let's put it that way. And having that, and what I appreciate about this ordinance is that it follows that procedure. I was one of the ones who worked on the county ordinance when we got that established back in 2012, and we were very happy that we have that benefit now. Those of us, I actually live just outside the city, And I'm very happy that we have that benefit of in-place market value. And I just wanted to thank you for having that in the ordinance.
Thank you. It is now to the committee to discuss. Do we have any? Yes.
Chair Sneddon, members of the committee, just real quickly, on the median and mean, the mean or the average is virtually the same for Ventura and Oxnard at about 28 and 35 miles respectively. For Santa Barbara County, the mean is considerably less. Rather than the median of 47 miles, the mean or average in Santa Barbara County is about 39 miles. Okay.
Thank you. Ask a follow-up question on that. So when it's weighted, so you're taking the number of units that are that distance away, and then that is what gets calculated in the average. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have some questions, I suppose, if it's to the committee. Maybe we could address some of these public comment questions. I agree that we'll need to move forward on a zoning issue on this, and that is, can you give us an update on that, or when we could look for that?
On December 8th, the City Council divided the AUD tasks, and the Council has directed that we start the process of removing the mobile home parks from AUD priority. That requires a zoning amendment and possibly a general plan change. So the staff are batching that with other general plan changes. So it's on a little slower track than the rest of the AUD changes. And the council has not, if I'm recalling, I don't think we've been directed to create mobile home park only zoning. Going back to the outset, there's a famous case out of Ukaipa, and the long story short is that you can do a senior only or mobile home park only type of zoning that creates that very restrictive narrow range of things that the owner can do with the property.
Would that be something that comes up in discussion during the AUD?
If
discussion?
The council wished to direct it, that would be a perfectly fine time.
Okay. Are there any comments or discussion from my colleagues? Yes? No? Councilmember Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, once again, Mr. Cullen, back to the basic question here, how far and how much is what we're trying to determine today, and I feel like I'm looking at some huge Venn diagram of state, county, city, and trying to figure out what overlaps and not trying to redo what's already done. Clearly, our intent is to protect these facilities to the extent which we can without stomping all over private property rights. So I'm a little not at ease at arbitrarily deciding a radius. I appreciate the data. And then one speaker said there are available homes to purchase or rent, but they're not necessarily available spaces within those radii to move a coach. If you owned your coach and wanted to move it, you may be outside of that radius. So I'm still struggling with that part of it. I'm assuming that the amounts that you have presented from the staff report dovetails somewhat with what goes on in other agencies, state agencies, and county, and so forth. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you are. I can't swear that they're identical to what the county has, but I can confirm that before we come to the council.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. And once again, that's something that flows a little bit beyond our expertise, and what we're trying to guess is the unforeseen circumstances of 5 or 10 years from now. And clearly we're, for the most part, dealing with a population that needs to have some assurance as what's going on in 5 or 10 years. So I don't have any answers. How about you, Madam Chair?
Well, I don't have answers, but I'm very pleased with this ordinance and the care that has and thoughtfulness that's gone into it. I feel satisfied through public comment and outreach that it has addressed as much as we can address without addressing the zoning issue. So I'm still looking forward to that, but I think within our current framework, this is a strong protection, and I think the 35 miles is somewhat arbitrary, and I'm comfortable moving that number ahead to council for full approval of that. I don't see any information that we have here at this time that would inform that decision one way or another. It is important to me, though, that it's not a requirement that it have to be within that 35 miles to receive that benefit. I think it has struck a nice balance between protecting the rights of the coach owners and the tenants at mobile home parks without completely disregarding property owner rights. And I think this is ready to move forward, and I appreciate the work that you've done on that. And if we have a motion.
I'll move staff recommendation.
Thank you, Councilmember Rouse. Second, Gutierrez. I think we're ready to take a roll call vote on that.
Councilmember Rouse?
Aye.
Councilmember Gutierrez?
Aye.
Madam Chair Snedden?
Aye. Thank you. So that closes our first item. And we'll move on to our second item, considering proposed residential tenant protection ordinances. And we will start with our staff report.
Thank you, Chair. And we will get that one queued up. Here we are. Okay. This one goes back to 2016 as well. And the process of looking at tenant protection measures started at one of your workload priority sessions at down at the beach in December of 2016, and you asked that my office prepare a report on possible tenant protection strategies. So I did that, and in March of 2017, I came out with a report, and the purpose of doing it was to develop some factual basis for any action you might want to take, give us a chance to work with housing staff about what was really happening with the housing market versus what was being reported. You recall the fall of 2016, certainly the Independent was reporting pretty heavily on landlord-tenant market issues. We also made an effort to engage interested parties in a much more significant way early on. So we did that. And met with the California Apartment Association. Tommy Thompson has been succeeded by Fred Dutton, if I am remembering correctly, and he's here today. Frank Rodriguez and Lucas Zucker came on behalf of CAUSE, and they're here today. Krista Pleiser from the Association of Realtors, Laura Bodie from the Rental Property Owners Association, and Leah Simon Weisberg from a San Francisco organization initially. So we started by looking at what existing city regulations are out there in this area. The biggie is rental housing mediation. The city's program is a very successful model. It was actually developed around the same time as the city of Palo Alto's rental housing mediation program, and the two are very similar, mid-70s, circa mid-70s, and very effective because of the skill of our rental housing mediators, and they handle a very high volume of cases, as you can see up on the slide. We also have an unusual ordinance that requires property owners to send the city clerk notice when they give a tenant notice to quit the premises. There are a couple of law firms in town that know to do that, so this is a law that is, I guess, was meant to provide the city with information about turnover in the market, but it's not observed very often. The city has laws that are largely duplicative now and superseded by state law that forbid housing discrimination. And we have some very limited tenant displacement assistance ordinances, and of course fire inspections on a biennial basis. So in that March report, I gave a list of options and gauged them from the least regulatory to the most, least regulatory being enhancing the existing rental housing mediation board program in some manner, the most regulatory being rent control. The council in March of 17 crossed off rent control, so that was the last we have discussed that. General conclusions, there were no fatal flaws in the various tenant protection strategies that I had identified, that is mediation, mandatory leases, safety inspections, just cause eviction, or even rent control, although rent control is of relatively limited value given how state law restricts it. I also concluded that the housing element gave you all the factual support you needed to get involved. The factual information, that's the renter-occupied housing as of 2012. That was the vacancy rate by 2014, about 0.6%. So there was a pretty hefty decline in the vacancy rate when we got started on this. I don't mean to make that as an argumentative statement. There's been quite a bit of discussion of late about changes in the vacancy rate and what the market's doing right now. So this is as of 2016. Now, you've seen this slide before. The average rents for one bedroom at $1,772 a month. I took the county affordability tables, and that rent is affordable to a household with an income of $70,880. And likewise, the two-bedroom rent is affordable to a household with income of $97,840. That's 30% AMI. The same data are here, and I've highlighted in red that upper moderate category for reasons that we'll come to. That upper moderate category is the threshold for eligibility for displacement assistance under the proposed mass no-cause eviction ordinance. We'll come back to that. More facts. 92% of housing built before 1990, that's relevant to rent control and what you can do. Very low growth rate. So these are just background facts. 16,000 or so multifamily units in 2014. That number fluctuates a bit in our own data. And again, affordable rents versus average. So in the 80 to 120 range, affordable rent is just under $2,200 by this table in your general plan. Meanwhile, 57 or so percent of Santa Barbara households earn less than $75,000. And finally, your RENA data, which you have seen. The state has required Santa Barbara to have zoned and available land for about 4,100 new housing units during the 8-year period of the housing element through to 2022. And you can see the need remains high. So let's talk about enhanced mediation. That's a process that the council decided not to do a mediation ordinance. Enhancements to that program are happening at the staff level, and I'm not in a position to report on what those enhancements might be. Mandatory leases, next slide. This is This was one of the 5 things I reported on in March of 2017. The idea is that while it doesn't control rent, it at least assures the tenant that they have the option to stay in one place for a year if they are so inclined. We also talked about a multifamily inspection program in 2017. These are used to make sure safe housing is protected. So you're looking for life safety conditions, and they're typically fee-based. There was a lot of discussion during the process about the Anaheim model, which is not fee-based, and the difficulty, of course, if you don't charge for the inspections, you don't have the money to do them. So just cause eviction was one of the options that we discussed. What is that about? Under state law, you don't need a reason to terminate a tenancy. There are unlawful reasons for terminating tenancy, like race, family status, ethnicity, but you don't need a reason. So what these just cause eviction laws do is basically say that if the tenant is in good standing paying their rent, you can't just terminate their tenancy unless they've done something wrong. And I use wrong very generously, like not paid rent or created a nuisance, illegal activity. So again, the idea is to create stability in the rental housing market. And it does it a bit more aggressively than the one-year lease. Instead, it restricts the property owner's ability to remove people from the premises. So what did the council do with the 4 of those that were left standing after rent control dropped? Remembering we had enhanced mediation, mandatory leases, just cause eviction, and apartment inspection. What the council did was tell us to go look at what was called by a task force you created in the spring of 2017, the Joint Protection and Accountability Initiative. When you peel away the layers, that was the one-year lease ordinance. So the council directed us to go ahead and prepare that. And then the second concern that the council had in the wake of the Ivy Apartments mass eviction was an ordinance that would provide relocation assistance if mass eviction happened. You also referred that question to your housing task force, and they made recommendations back to the city council, which led to the drafting we've done for today. So let's talk about what's in front of the council as it came from the task force to the council and back to staff. So we're proposing with mandatory lease offers to add a new chapter to the code. It's very simple in concept. In most situations, landlords have to offer a one-year lease. Let's look at the details. And the details, by the way, were primarily where the realtors and the Rental Property Association were concerned. The ordinance that I brought to the committee in October was very general. It didn't specify what the forms would look like or when they would have to be sent. So the comments that the committee received from those 2 organizations were really focused on those details. So we tried to address them. So who's covered? Well, let's see what isn't covered. Single-family dwellings, hotels, lawful vacation rentals, which we added in a meeting last week. Co-housing. We've had a question today from the jointly posed by the Realtors, Rental Property Association, and State Apartment Association, asking whether owner-occupied housing extends to duplexes and triplexes. The language, which is in G2 in the ordinance, was not intended to apply to duplexes and triplexes. It was intended to apply to co-housing. And if that's the committee's wish, we'll want to clarify that. So it's fairly limited to begin with. It's still pretty simple. The landlord has to offer a written lease that has a minimum term of a year. It has to be in writing. The offer can be the lease. The tenant has to reject it, and the property owners asked that we provide forms so that there was clarity in terms of acceptance and rejection. Those are major events in terms of the consequences of the ordinance. So I've added language to the ordinance that requires my office to prepare and post on the web forms that people can use for those purposes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that while the lease is required, the ordinance doesn't require the lease to be at a fixed rent for the entire 12 months. So it's conceivable that a property owner could say, in 6 months I'm raising the rent, write that into the lease. This is not an effort to change the economic relationship. It's an effort to give stability to the tenant at whatever the price is that may be required. The remedies are really built around the notion that the ordinance would be self-enforcing by providing tenants with defenses in actions to collect rent and recover premises. So one of the changes that we made through the civic engagement process is that actions to collect rent, the tenant's defense would only be as to the differential in the increased rent they were paying that they wouldn't have paid had they accepted a lease. And today, a member of the public has suggested another revision on the remedies. I'll let him present it to you, but I have language that could address it. Okay, so public comments on mandatory leases. Again, as I mentioned, realtors wanted more specificity. It's a great comment. We've modified the chapter extensively to provide that, and I think we are in general agreement on the terms of that ordinance. So we can take questions on that if you would like, Chair Sneddon, or we can go on to the tenant displacement and mass no-cause eviction ordinance.
Do we have questions at this time? Okay, let's keep going.
Okay. This one's harder. What came to the City Council was a recommendation for a just cause eviction ordinance. And a just cause eviction ordinance would apply to as few as 1 evictions. In other words, a just cause eviction ordinance creates an individual right in the individual tenant. The mass no-cause eviction doesn't work that way. What it does is assume or presume that there is either an improper motive or, more appropriately, an unacceptable impact when a large number of tenants are displaced at the same time. So the idea behind the mass eviction ordinance is that it's a different kind of injury, not only to the community but to the tenants, when an entire property or a significant portion of a property is cleaned out at once without some good reason. So it's pretty important in the title of the ordinance to recognize the no cause phrase there. This is limited to terminations of tenancy that don't have an acceptable reason. Okay.
May I ask a question quickly
Sure.
there? So is that as defined by the state at this point? What constitutes cause, or is it as defined through our ordinance, or are they compatible?
No, the state is silent on cause, so with the exception of what you can't remove someone for. So the causes are of your definition, and they're spelled out in the ordinance.
Thank you.
Okay. So this talks about what I just said, mass no-cause evictions. Okay, so the last one we had to deal with dollars and miles. Similarly here, The committee has not yet defined what mass eviction means, nor have you landed on exactly how much compensation is warranted when a mass eviction happens, and you haven't approved the specific definition or list of what constitutes a no-cause eviction. So task force and council direction was as follows. The ordinance relocation assistance benefits would kick in only for projects with 15 units or more. For smaller projects, as you can see from the slide, with 6 to 14 units, there would be a mandatory conciliation meeting where the landlord could use a rental housing mediation board member or a private mediator at the landlord's expense to provide a conciliation opportunity for the tenant. The other limiting factor is this ordinance only applies in 2 zoning districts, the R3 and the R4. Those are the multifamily, traditional multifamily zoning districts. And so the slide up there highlights the quantitative elements that are missing. How many units during what period of time constitutes a mass eviction? In our civic engagement, we discussed with the realtors a threshold of 35% of the units in any 12-month period, which would, for a 15-unit property, allow up to 5 no-cause evictions per year without triggering the ordinance. You need to decide what kind of threshold you would like. Now, in terms of dollars, the base assistance is 4 times the rental rate, or $5,000, whichever's greater, and it's paid to eligible households. And as I mentioned, eligible households are those at 120% of AMI or lower. There is a supplemental assistance in addition to the 4 times rent that is payable to certain special needs tenants within those households. And those are households that are at 80% AMI, low mod households, self-disclosed disabled tenants, emancipated minors, and seniors 60 or older. They would each get $3,000 in additional assistance beyond the amount provided to the eligible household. The ordinance has been changed through civic engagement to require those tenants to notify the owner, and if they're not on the lease or rental agreement, to prove that the landlord was aware that they were their tenants. And that seems like a balancing protection for the owners. Okay, same thing is true for mass eviction as the landlord tenant mandatory lease requirement, and that is strong remedies are really important. What we're trying to do with these laws is give tenants the ability to protect themselves without creating another enforcement bureaucracy for the city to be involved with. So the ordinance, with some amendments, allows tenants remedies if they haven't been properly treated under the ordinance. So last time the committee asked for some follow-up on the numbers. The Housing Task Force had come up with a 15-unit threshold, and the specific question I believe Councilmember Sneddon asked was how many units is that? What does that mean in terms of Santa Barbara? And I've taken a stab at answering that with Sue Gray's assistance. So this is a little bit of a busy chart, but we'll start with it. What this is showing is the size of multi-unit dwellings along the x-axis, along the bottom, the unit size categories. So you'll see on the far left, 2 units, 3 to 6, 7 to 14. The proposed threshold would encompass everything from 15 to 20 to the right. So if you're looking at that and you wanted to do the math, it would be the sum of what's in those yellow boxes or the percentage sum of what's in the light blue boxes. Now, in a more helpful form, 15-unit threshold would cover about 37% of the rental units in Santa Barbara. A 7-unit threshold would cover about 57%, and a 3-unit threshold would cover about 80%. Staff has no position on that, but I wanted the committee to have that information. And in one more way to slice and dice it, this is just the table from which those charts were derived, and you have that for your reference. Okay. Ready for questions and discussions on mass eviction.
Councilmember Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Colon, when it came to setting the threshold, I know this was something that the task force talked about and probably beat to death, but clearly this was triggered by the Ivy apartment issue that happened earlier on a couple of years ago. Is there a determination of the likelihood, and this may be a question for the real estate community, the likelihood of these certain size units falling into this circumstance where they'd be purchased, converted, purchased, rehabbed? In other words, in terms of the marketplace, does it make more sense? Are tenancies more at risk in the larger multi-family units than they are in the smaller 1 to 7 or that? Is there an answer to that? I'm just trying to peel back the logic on why we are where we are.
It's beyond my expertise if there is an answer to that one. Maybe Ms. Gray could address it.
Chair Sneddon, Committee Member Rouse. I also don't have the actual data on that. I think as far as the issues that come up to the rental housing mediation program are the larger ones. Those are the ones that we hear about the most. I don't have any data on whether that happens in smaller ones. They just don't rise to the level.
Thank you. And then one more question, Mr. Cullen, to the first part of the presentation, is that the single-family residences are not required to provide, they're under the lease part of the law in terms of providing a written lease?
That's correct.
Okay. If you own a single-family residence, are you required to have a city business license to rent a house out, to own a house out? Okay.
No,
If you have multiple single-family residences, are you required to have a business license?
That one I don't know. I think 3 units is 3 units or more gets you a business license, but I'm not sure about multiple single-family.
Okay, well, there's something I'm getting at, but I'll go to that later on then. Thank you.
I think at this time then we will have public comment, beginning with pool time for Lucas Zucker, pooling time with Frank Rodriguez for a total of 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Lucas Zucker, Policy Director at CAUSE. We are here today to say that we need to do much better than this proposal to provide Santa Barbara families with basic security in their homes. We really appreciate staff's time on this and know that the input from interested parties was certainly extensive, to say the least. But we believe that this proposal, supported by the landlords here, is riddled with exemptions and restrictions to the point where it excludes the majority of the city's renters right off the bat and barely provides basic protections to the few people it does cover, if they can even figure out if it applies to them. Few examples. First, you must live in an R3 or R4 zone to qualify. This is mostly in District 6. Council members Rouse and Sneddon, it pretty much doesn't cover essentially any part of your district, and Councilmember Gutierrez only covers one side of San Andres Street, right? It also makes it extremely difficult for a regular person to know if they qualify. What normal person actually knows if they live in an R3 zone? Second, to receive a penny of displacement assistance, you have to have more than 15 people displaced at once with no cause. Only a third of the housing units you can see are even qualify under that to begin with. And when most people get an eviction notice, they don't know how many other people were displaced, right? So it would be extremely difficult for them to figure that out. Third, your household also has to meet the income threshold. We worry about excluding large families that have multiple adult low-income earners, like an extended family all living in one apartment, which is extremely common in Santa Barbara's immigrant community. If you don't meet all these qualifications, you're not protected by this ordinance. And if it does apply, often it may be hard to understand if you qualify. And remember that all of this is not to stop an eviction. This is the hurdles that are put in the way of an evicted tenant even receiving displacement assistance, who does still have to leave their home. Of course, you see if a landlord evicts between 6 and 14 households all at once, all they have to do is sit through one non-binding mediation session. They can even hire a mediator of their choice. They can hire their cousin, right? No results of this session are binding, so if there's a company that really is a bad actor, it really just creates a minor inconvenience on the way to them kicking out a dozen families onto the street with no assistance. And of course, for evictions under 6 families at a time, there's no protection at all, nothing. When the city passed this tenant displacement assistance for demolition in 2006, over a decade ago, they didn't limit it to certain zones of the city or to a certain number of people being evicted. The city then, I have the staff report here, said that no matter how many people are evicted, they considered this, right? The impact to a family is still the same. If a family is faced with having to leave their home, with potentially having to take their kids out of the school district, having to, maybe move to a city far away from their job, risk experiencing homelessness, potentially living with a car, given the low vacancy rate, whether it's one person or 100 people, the effect on that family is still the same. And that's why the city didn't include these restrictions in what was passed over a decade ago. So here we are in a housing crisis much worse than we were in 2006, and actually proposing something much weaker than what was proposed then. So I would say no wonder the landlords support it. Even worse, if a landlord wants to carry out a mass displacement of over 15 people without paying any displacement assistance, they actually still can. Under the mandatory lease, they would just have to wait till the end of each of those 15 people's lease, let it expire, and then refuse to renew that lease. So if we think about the worst mass displacement we've had in many years here in the city, the Ivy Apartments that really triggered a lot of this wouldn't have actually protected those tenants from displacement. It would have just delayed their displacement by less than a year. So the truth is, I think it's not accurate to say that this, as I maybe said earlier, this ordinance only protects a fraction of Santa Barbara's population from displacement. In terms of actually stopping evictions, it really protects virtually no one. And I think you'll hear folks talk today about how this is difficult, and many landlords here are really great managers and take care of their tenants, and we really have no doubt about that. But we think good landlords have nothing to fear from this. So we're urging the committee to push the reset button and put a simple just cause on your agenda for the next meeting. Just cause ordinance keeps it simple. Just don't evict anyone without a fair reason. Doesn't matter if you live in an R3 zone or anything like that. I don't think we're asking for much. We are asking for families in our community to not live in daily fear of eviction and have basic security and stability in their homes. We think it's incredibly reasonable, and we urge you committee members to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Michelle Robinson, followed by Andy Alexander.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Snedden, and council members. I'm Michelle Robertson. I'm here today representing the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association. I was not on the task force when that was put together, but I was very careful not to take away anything that the task force agreed upon when I did come into these discussions. And I'd like to thank the entire council for taking your time with this issue to ensure that we're crafting the rules and regulations that provide tenants more rights to keep our communities intact within our city, but are also not unduly burdensome to landlords. Burden could have an unintended consequence that could include removing rental inventory from the market, which is going backwards. both ordinances together, I think, piggyback on each other because you'll be locking people into one-year term leases, plus you'll be preventing the mass evictions on top of that with displacements if people are on already a term lease. As mentioned in our letter with the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors and the California Apartment Association, we need to make sure that education is first and foremost promoted in our community. I've been to some of the tenant rights meetings, and I've had the privilege of working with cause leadership on these ordinances. I'm a first-generation Latina raised by a single mother in a Spanish-speaking household. I know how challenging it is to access information, let alone understand the various laws that are in place that protect the horrendous acts that we hear about right now. I had the benefit of getting the education, but it does not take the sting away from looking back and realizing that my life could have been different had my family been aware of the laws that exist already that protect tenants. This is why I'm passionate about the education component of the task force recommendations. There are many laws and regulations that already exist that protect the tenants regarding repairs, habitability, tenancies, retaliations, terminations, evictions, discriminations. We at SBRPA, we put on programs to educate landlords on what their responsibilities are towards tenants. And we hope that tenants could also have that same access to that education so that they also understand what their rights are. I believe that there are both tenants and landlords that just simply don't understand their existing rights, which is why within the letter we submitted, we gave an example booklet of what could be handed out to tenants so that both sides know what the rights are and what the responsibilities are when renting a unit. We're also preparing a community forum to give rights on renting a unit. But I would like to touch a little bit upon the comments requiring the one-year lease submitted in our letter. We have concerns that if we've offered a year term and then we offered it at the end of the term and the tenant does not want it, I think it's burdensome to require it to continue every year, continuing offering that term after it's been rejected by the tenant. Our housing providers could accidentally fall out of compliance simply because they've already heard they don't want to continue on with another year term and they want the flexibility of being able to move out on their terms. I understand that there's a clarifying point regarding the applicability section on what does owner-occupied unit mean. Our hope is that it could be owner-occupied property for duplexes because the owners are in close quarters with the tenant that they're managing for, and it's very difficult conversation to say why they don't want to renew the lease if they feel that there's any drug abuses or nuisances happening, but they just can't prove it. I thank you for the opportunity to express our thoughts and concerns with the two ordinances. My colleague with the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors will voice our thoughts and concerns regarding the relocation assistance to tenants impacted by the mass no-cause evictions or other no-cause termination of leases. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Andy Alexander, followed by Fred Sutton.
Good afternoon, Chair Snedden, council members. I'm Andy Alexander, past president and current chair of the Government Relations Committee, Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. I would like to thank Michelle for bringing up our points regarding the importance of education and the required one-year lease offers to residential tenants. As you read in our letter, we have comments and questions regarding the required relocation assistance to tenants impacted by mass no-cause terminations of residential tenancies. I would like to drill down a little more into our thought process for the table breakdown and the formula for relocation assistance. What we discussed is that the relocation assistance would not affect 1 to 5 units. We propose for units 6 to 14 to have no monetary assistance, but have non-binding mediation and the first right of refusal to the current tenant. This would be designed to keep communities together. For 15 or more units, we recommend simplifying the calculations and to have the relocation assistance be 3 times the current rent, because this covers the first, last, and deposit for a new rent. This relocation assistance is not meant for the tenant to make money, but to have relocation assistance. We also suggest adding an additional 1-month rent should the tenant fall under the special circumstances under subsection C. And that would clear up any issues with how median rents are calculated in the past. In order to be fair, but also ensure that private market is not drastically affected by the risk and return of owning rental property, we propose that the trigger for relocation should happen when there are no-cause terminations of 35% or more of the units over a 12-month period. This will ensure that when mass no-cause terminations occur, that the tenants will be properly compensated. This very specifically addresses the issue of investment companies coming into town and terminating tenancies with many units, such as what happened with the IV apartments. Thank you for your considerations on these ordinances and for all the time that you work with for the city attorney, the tenants, landlords, put into creating ordinances that are fair for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker will be Fred Sutton, followed by Jay Hartz.
Honorable Chair and council members, it's a pleasure. My name is Fred Sutton. I'm here on behalf of the California Apartment Association. We represent housing providers here in Santa Barbara and throughout the state of California. Thank you very much for all the time spent on this issue. I wanted to reiterate some of my colleagues' concerns and a couple of the policy issues that are still outstanding, particularly as it relates to the mandatory offering of a lease year after year despite a rejection. Hypothetically, in this scenario, you could offer a lease 10 years in a row. It's rejected for 10 years. In year 11, you don't offer it in a timely manner, and you're held liable. We do suggest that upon a rejection, it falls back to the normal month-to-month, and perhaps a remedy that could be added in. Upon a rent increase after a rejection at a future date, a tenant would have the ability to get back involved and start up a conversation about a lease for the term. I think that minor change would not cause an issue with the integrity and the spirit of the ordinance, but would help with some of the compliance issues on behalf of rental housing providers. In the mass non-renewal section or ordinance, we do find that the damages section is very severe. There's a minimum threshold, but not an upper threshold. I understand the intention because we want compliance. You need to have people pay these relocation fees, but it creates liability for mere attempts of recovery. So, for instance, if you do not include the proper notice, you're held liable, and there's no room to cure or anything of that nature. So perhaps an ability to cure or setting an upper threshold limit would be appropriate. Again, I think our aim is to have compliance and to have people pay the relocation, but not fall into an innocent mistake that leads them to financial problems. What was already mentioned by my colleague, reasonable relocation. Individuals have received this service of housing for their rent. We do believe that a reasonable relocation, 4 months, seems very high cost-wise. Something else that came up from the dais I wanted to address very quickly was the 15-unit threshold. In the task force, the state sees 15 units and above inherently differently than the rest of properties. At a 15-unit property, you have to have a resident manager that's on site. It's a completely different type of operation, intensity-wise. And under 15 is more of what we consider an independent rental owner. And when you start to place these costs for relocation on independent rental owners, you're starting to cut individuals out of the ability to get into the housing market, and we want people to offer housing. And lastly, education. I know that was already mentioned. It's in your packets, but I wanted to hand out what a pamphlet would look like that we're trying to make Santa Barbara-centric. So thank you very much for all your time on this.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Jay Hartz, followed by Suela Cabrera.
Thank you. My name is Jay Hartz. My wife Terry and I are retired and own a couple small rental properties in Santa Barbara, very small rental properties. Anyway, I had one comment concerning the proposed ordinance regarding one-year leases, which I had an opportunity to discuss very briefly with the city attorney this morning. It has to do with the defense to action to recover possession, which is at page 6 of the ordinance. If you're looking at it, section A, it currently says, failure of a landlord to comply with any of the provisions of this chapter shall provide the tenant with a defense in any legal action brought by the landlord to recover possession. If you take that language literally, what it means is the landlord can't evict the tenant even if they are damaging the property, even if they're creating a nuisance to the neighbors, even if they're not paying rent. It also would mean that if the tenant had moved in without a one-year lease and a one-year lease hadn't been offered, they'd lived there for 3 years on a month-to-month basis. Landlord now says, you need to leave. Tenant says, no, I have a defense. You can't put me out now. But what the tenant would have received had the landlord acted properly was 1 year, an opportunity for a one-year lease. So what this should say, it seems to me, is it ought to say there's a defense to any no-cause eviction within 1 year from the time the rental relationship began, because that's what the tenant would have gotten had the landlord complied, and no cause deals with, it gets you out of the world of damage to the property, non-payment of rent, and I think no cause has been defined in the other ordinance. You could just adopt that language, I think. So I hope that's useful. I think without it, you're going to have confusion and litigation because you can see what somebody's going to make of that language if you don't clarify it. Second, very briefly, on the notion of offering a one-year lease at the end of each lease term, I agree with the comments made that I think that's burdensome and unnecessary. In my experience, we've had tenants who come in under a one-year lease, which is what we typically do, and then it converts to month-to-month relationship thereafter. By the end of a year, you know whether you're getting along, you know whether they're taking care of the property. It isn't a big issue after that. So I think that's an adequate way to handle the situation. If there's a problem, you're going to know it by the end of the first year, and you can decide not to offer a new lease if that's what you think. But once you're beyond that on a month-to-month basis, if you've had that experience, I haven't found a problem with it. I think that's the way it's handled a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Zoila Cabrera, followed by Soledad Javier.
Sí, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Zoila Cabrera.
Good afternoon. My name is Zoila Cabrera.
Queremos una ordenanza más fuerte,
We want an ordinance that's stronger,
una ordenanza justa,
an ordinance with just cause,
que los propietarios nos den un año los contratos de vivienda.
that the property owners give us a one-year lease.
Cuando sea un desalojo, estamos pidiendo el apoyo que se nos dé una relocación.
When there's an eviction, we want a relocation assistance.
Pedimos relocación.
We ask for relocation assistance.
Es una inmoralidad que se nos desaloje.
It's immoral to have us evicted.
Somos familias con niños.
We are families with children.
En los desalojos,
in the evictions,
somos afectados hasta estudiantes de los colegios.
We are even affected when we are college students.
Yo no quiero que mis nietos y mis nietas
I don't want my grandchildren
pasen por estos desalojos.
To go through these evictions.
Y por eso pido el apoyo.
And that's why I'm asking for the support
de una ordenanza justa.
Of an ordinance with just cause.
Con relocación.
With relocation assistance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You still have a minute and a half if you want to reserve that time for later. Soledad Javier?
She's not here. She had to leave, but she said I could speak on her behalf. Is that okay?
Do you also have a speaker slip?
No.
Is that? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, please go ahead and speak, and then you can fill out the slip after.
Thank you. So I will be speaking on behalf of Soledad Javier. She had to leave, unfortunately. She has work. Soledad Javier wanted to speak to you all about her family. Under this ordinance, her family would not be protected. Her family is facing an unjust eviction in a matter of days, specifically on March 10th. The landlord has not given a specific reason of why they would like the family to be evicted. Every time the landlord is asked of why they want to evict the family, it's always a new story. The family has put in over $10,000 of their own money to make out-of-pocket repairs on the house. She has a 42-year-old son who is disabled, and finding accessible housing has been very difficult and stressful for their family. In a matter of days, this family will not be protected by the current laws in place or by the ordinance being proposed. They do not qualify for relocation assistance, and they will be left out of a home that they have built themselves in the last 16 years. We need a just cause ordinance immediately, and we do not want to continue to bring in more families telling their stories. We need action now. So thank you.
Thank you. I made an error. Reserved time, we don't reserve time on public comment, so that was, your time is spent. Thank you. Teresa Gray, followed by Petra Lowen. We do have 2 sets of microphones if you'd rather use. Take your time.
I'm here to ask you to be really careful that you don't make things so difficult for owners that they choose to do other things. We have just sold a duplex to a family that is planning to live in it and have their grandparents use the other part. So there are 2 rental units gone right now. In Santa Monica, where we lived before, when they started to add restrictions, there were 45,000 rental units. Now there are only 35 because so many people have changed their rental units, or the people haven't, but people just don't want to be renting things in Santa Monica unless they're really stuck. And when you spend your whole life trying to prepare for your older years, because you know that you don't get much for your retirement or Social Security, and you've worked very, very hard all these years to have your owner's rights just dwindling and dwindling, it's kind of scary. I know you have, I really don't want things to happen like what happened in Santa Barbara. I've never evicted anybody, and we've always, we're the kind of landlords that the tenants would like to have because we don't raise our rents. The people that live in places that we own can keep the same rents. I had somebody for 27 years at the same rent because our costs didn't go up, and I didn't feel it was necessary to make more money at the expense of other people. The things that I'm really concerned about is that your definition would be able to include duplexes and triplexes because those were what were the worst affected. If you live very close to people that are doing bad things and you don't want them to live there anymore, and you live right there, it really does impact your life. So I do think that at least duplexes and triplexes should be excluded. Let me tell you the other things too. There are 2 other things. How does one prove that the landlord knows that they live there? We've had cases where somebody comes to visit for a few days and then comes back to visit for a few days and comes back again to visit for a few days. And finally, the person is living there and the family moved out because the unit was too small. But how would I have proved that it wasn't a visitor? That's something that you really should consider. Just a second here. Okay, and the last thing is, if they reject a 1-year lease, are you required to rent to them for whatever time they want? Because in our case, for example, we prefer to start with a 1-year lease because we figure it gives us time to get, because when somebody moves, you have a lot of work to do to get it ready for the next person. And so you want to make sure that they'll be there long enough so you don't have to do it again right away. If you're not required to rent to them for less time than a lease, there should be at least a form that says, I reject this lease, and we should be able to have that as a protection against a lawsuit later on. I don't mind at all offering 1-year leases because I think it's a good way to go, for at least for our situation and for other people. They need the security. But after the lease is over, like Jay said, you really know what the situation is, and we bought one property because the rental agents would rent it to people that would be so inconsiderate of the neighborhood that the whole neighborhood would write letters to the owner, who was an older lady who had moved to live with her daughter, and she would have never allowed it, but the rental agent didn't really know what was going on, and so it wrecked the whole neighborhood. We ended up writing to her and saying, hey, we would like to buy your house. Can you help us? We don't have a lot of money. And so she did, because she knew what it was doing to the neighborhood. And we never did rent to anybody who would do the disruptive things like that again. But we have sold that duplex now because of the controls that you're threatening to put on us. But anyway, and it's going to be off the rental market, and I'm sorry to see that, because I know people need rental. And the older we get, the more I see it. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. Petra Lowen, followed by Mickey Flax.
Good afternoon, Chair Sneddon and audience members. My name is Petra Lowen. I work at the Independent Living Resource Center. We're a private nonprofit organization serving individuals with disabilities. I provide help people find and maintain housing, and obviously having a steady place to live is extremely important. Having to move unexpectedly is very costly, and the housing market is very tight. So it would definitely help our consumers to have additional protections. About a year and a half ago, I was on that task force, and we discussed just ordinance and never came to a very good conclusion. I just hope that the City Council will adopt a just cause ordinance. I do want to point out, if someone rents under Section 8, the federal government requires that a landlord can only give a notice to vacate if there is a reason. So there has to be a cause. And I just hope that the City Council will follow that. I think there are many wonderful property owners, like the couple that just spoke, and I don't want to, I think they should not be burdened unnecessarily, but as far as I know, there are provisions if a renter does not take care of the property or disrupts the neighborhood, that would be a reason to evict them. So I just hope that there will be additional protections for renters that are desperately needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mickey Flax will be followed by Jenny Hale.
Hello, I'm Mickey Flax. I must apologize. First of all, I feel like I'm a day late and $1 short. I know this has been going on for some time, but I have been first ill, then out of town, then ill again, and doesn't pay to leave Santa Barbara. You should know that. I have a product from the coalition, Just Cause and others. I'm speaking also on behalf of SB Can, and I'd like you to pass these out, including to our print. I'm one of the authors of the county's Just Cause ordinance. You know that the county still seems to be in pretty good shape. Socialism has not taken over. Everything seems to be working fine, and yet it has a Just Cause ordinance. The worst thing about it is that we did not include a good system for record keeping, and so we don't have details, and it makes it a little hard to evaluate. But there haven't been mass evictions. The experience of the county can be useful in designing the city's ordinance. An ordinance that claims to be a just cause ordinance has to be designed to respect the dignity and well-being of a majority of Santa Barbarans who are renters. I have no doubt that the landlords feel threatened by all of this. The landlords feel threatened, and businesses feel threatened sometimes by any kind of regulation. On the whole, over the centuries, the increase in regulation, I believe, has been good for this country and this state rather than bad. We have to understand that people live in what they consider a home. not somebody's investment, and that they should be treated with the respect due to at least to a customer. If a storekeeper treated his customers, or a restaurateur treated his customers the way some landlords treat their tenants, they would be out of business very quickly. And that's wrong. Each day of delay of a just cause ordinance can mean misery for some Santa Barbara family. I mean misery. I recommend to you highly the book Evicted, which was published last year by Professor Matthew Desmond. Became a bestseller. He received a MacArthur Award on the basis of that book. And what it is about is how eviction affects people, all kinds of people. And it is not simply an inconvenience that can be remedied by dollars. I mean, the dollars help deal with, find a new home. But even that is a terrible blow to a family and is responsible for illness, responsible for death, actually. Eviction is not a simple thing. And there's a great deal of misunderstanding that I heard today. Namely, that state law doesn't say anything about the causes for eviction. There's a whole section, half a page, that has all of the tenancies that may be terminated under a normal 30 to 60-day notice if the tenant has not paid their rent, continued to violate the lease, refuses to sign a new lease that is identical to the old one. So that's illegal under state law for a tenant to not sign the same lease if they accepted the first one. The tenant has damaged the unit. The tenant has continued to disturb other tenants and neighbors. The tenant is convicted of using a rental unit for illegal purposes.
Ms. Flax, you are over time if you want to finish.
Et cetera. There's been a lot of people over time. I know that you can read this yourself, but the proposal of 15 or more is based not on the Ivy apartments. It was an arbitrary number from the conversion of a rental property on Modoc to condos some years ago, I think in the last century, that is in the 1990s, but might have been later. These rules should apply to all tenants. By the proposed ordinance here excludes 60 to 70% of the rental population.
I do need to stop you because we have more speakers and they will not get their chance to speak.
Okay, I should have come earlier. I urge you, I beg you, I plead to recognize the rights of people who live, the majority of people who live in this community, who need a law that has nothing to do with zoning, R1s, R2s, or income, or anything like that, but simply protect them in ways that the state has not yet gotten to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny Hale, followed by our final speaker, Jacob Lesher Buxton.
Good afternoon, council members. I will keep it short because I think I'm about to get a parking ticket. But thank you for allowing me to speak. I am a concerned community member, and I am here in support of the proposal that was laid out by Cause. I believe and I urge you to strengthen the mandatory one-year lease with the proper tenant protections that truly protect against unjust evictions that a just cause ordinance provides. We have seen a 24% decline in the Latino population here in Santa Barbara since 2011. That is an astounding number. Thousands of people in our community have left this city because of rent hikes and evictions. Families are forced to leave their homes in Santa Barbara every day. With our current housing crisis, how can we propose such a small solution like a tenant protection ordinance that doesn't even cover the whole east side and west side? This is personal to me as I am a landlord in Santa Barbara, and I believe that housing is not a privilege, it is a right. And I just urge you to address the housing crisis with strong tenant protections, not Band-Aid solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final speaker, Jacob Lesher Buxton.
Good afternoon. For the record, Jacob, yes, no work stream system training advocate for ILOC. I support Cole's proposal for 2 reasons. One, I'm from Oakland, and if anyone knows about Oakland, we had this thing called gentrification a couple years ago where all the rents went up and people are now being kicked out because they can't pay their rent and they're living on the street. I know some people have this fantasy that if the rent goes up too much, people will simply move out of town. And in Oakland, people now live under underpasses, thousands of them. And I can tell for a fact that the train will accomplish roads like tent cities, which is already happening and about to get much worse if just cause doesn't pass. And my second reason is I enjoyed the first part of the meeting on mobile home relocation assistance. And could someone explain to me, sorry I wasn't educated in a good school, why this city would care more about people who live in mobile home than in fixed apartments. Thank you.
Thank you. That closes public comment. It's to the council. We'll do what we can today, and if we need to hold it over, we'll hold it over. It's an important issue.
Mr. Casey's informed me that next week's open.
Thank you. Did you have a comment at this time?
Well, I'm trying to put 10 pounds of ordinance into a 5-pound bag, so that didn't really work out too well today. I will just say that I'm encouraged by the amount of work that was done. I'm very, very proud of the work of the task force. I see a lot of work and preparation done by the realtors and the landlord associations. I would hope that CAUSE, rather than just to criticize them, would take these line by line, present us with line item responses, if you would, please, before we get together again. Because right now, I was about ready to ask if you guys had been to the task force, and it didn't sound responsive. These people were responsive. So I would suggest, for our purposes and for the conversation we're going to have apparently next week, that you take this opportunity to inform us precisely and line by line exactly what it is that you think we should settle on. And maybe by next week we can do all that.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to hear more about the just cause eviction ordinance and get more information on that. And I thank everyone who's come and had their voices heard and addressed the issues that